Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian.
This is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. Pertaining, related, we don't care. I don't care. You care. Brian cares.
Words matter.
They do. You know what they do, Brian?
And that's the subject of what we're talking about.
We're talking about words. We're talking about words
and
today.
We're using words to talk about words.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you all, taking a listen. We've been off here for a couple weeks. You've been busy. I've been busy. Yeah, it's just school starting up for me again, and so we're back in the throes of it.
Been reading for class too, so yeah.
Well, and which kind of leads us to today, because you got it assigned. You were given a book to read, and I was like, I'll read it with you so we can have some conversations.
Yeah,
and we are both like, I knew the premise of the book, but I'd never read it myself, and so we're gonna have some conversation.
Yeah, it's The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser, and it's actually one of these books that makes the rounds, and I think people become interested in it. He makes some very different kind of arguments and some shocking kind of things, and the people who really dig it, and so you hear his name come up from time to time. Well, you know what I'm saying? Like he makes some really interesting arguments in it, and we're going to talk about. We thought we'd actually do 2 episodes on this. Part 1, we're going to focus primarily on the Old Testament. Part 2 on the New Testament, what he says about it. It's a big book, about 417 pages, something like that.
It's not something you just pick up and blow right through. Yeah,
right. But it was one of these we kept texting each other. Hey, where are you at? Have you gotten to this part yet? And we really found it interesting. Found some things to talk about. So let me just give you a little background for it. This book was put out 10 years ago. The 10th anniversary edition is just going to be put out later this summer. And one of the interesting things about this book is when Heiser put it out, he about every third page, he says, there's not enough room to talk about this, so you can go to my companion website and find this. And he does have this website out there that has lots of supplementary information. As I understand, this 10th anniversary edition of The Unseen Realm, that's the title of the book, The Unseen Realm, is going to bring a lot of those notes into the text itself. Logos software, Heiser worked for Logos for a long time, several years. He did pass away just a little over 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Passed away just not long after his 60th birthday from, I think it was pancreatic cancer, if I'm not mistaken.
It was, yeah.
And was that okay? And so I put that in the notes. I thought, I meant to check that. I better be careful. So if you can confirm that.
Yes, I can confirm that.
But like I said, it's kind of engaged people who aren't even necessarily that familiar with scholarly study. He writes in an interesting manner. He really kind of draws in a lot of things. And he asks the kind of questions, as we've talked about before, that people are really interested in. Some of those really strange passages. In fact, we'll talk today a little bit about that. If there's one passage we get asked about probably more than any other, it's Genesis 6, the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. Yep. And Heiser tells you what it means. He's really into those kind of things. And I heard him described on another podcast. They said those passages that we tend to kind of gloss over, he leans into, right? And he really spends a lot of time in them. So he's also had a presence on YouTube. He had a couple of podcasts that he did on different kinds of subjects. And so he's engaged a different kind of audience than you typically see in your more scholarly. But I mean, he really knew his stuff. We're going to see that he knew a lot with biblical languages. He was an Old Testament scholar, but he was very familiar with the other Semitic languages, with Greek, and makes a lot of arguments from that. So today, talking about the Old Testament, when Heiser begins his book, he really talks about kind of what got him into this line of study. And he was already a PhD student. He was studying an Old Testament passage, and the way he describes it, he was in church one day, and one of his fellow PhD students handed him a Bible and said, "Hey, read this verse." And I'll go ahead and have you read it. Psalm 82:1, if you want to read that.
Yeah, so it's let me pull it up here on another window.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, that's all right.
I have it. It's in the notes too, if you want to look there.
Yeah. So God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods.
Okay, and so Heiser read that, and of course, with his familiarity with Hebrew, he realized that the word God there, God presides in the great assembly. And don't let me forget, I want to come back and talk about that. But then he renders judgment among the gods. He recognized in Hebrew that's the same word. And I do have to explain a little bit here. The word for that we translate God in the Old Testament is Elohim. And anytime you have a Hebrew word with that "im" ending, that's a masculine plural ending. And so there is no, it's not typically a singular form of God. It's Elohim is the way that it's often rendered. And you have to look at the context in order to decide, is this talking about God or is it talking about gods? Because it's naturally plural. There are some other words in Hebrew like that. You see this sometimes in the King James language. For example, the word waters or the word heavens are always in the plural in Hebrew. So it's just a feature of the language. But in this passage, Psalm 82, God presides over in the great assembly and judges the gods. And he's like, well, that really kind of freaked him out. So he really started to study this. And so what he proposes, and one of the main parts of his kind of understanding of Scripture, is the idea of the divine counsel. And this is not an unusual feature. You see other Old Testament scholars writing in this area and thinking about this area. But it's the idea that there are these places in Scripture where God seems to be kind of on his throne and he's surrounded by these other spiritual beings is kind of the term I've decided to use today for this. Heiser uses different terms to talk about this divine counsel, but these are other spiritual beings that surround God, and he kind of sometimes interacts with them and talks to them about judgments and these kind of things. Now, Heiser's clear. This is not polytheism. That he's not proposing that these are other gods. And in fact, he says Elohim probably refers more to the fact that they are spiritual in nature, that, maybe gods is not even a good translation for them. But this idea of the divine counsel is where he begins.
Yeah, well, and I can't remember if I heard this on a podcast or somewhere else, but it was the concept that Heiser takes is like, God is not the only Elohim, spiritual being, but there is no Elohim like God.
Like God, right. He is in a different category all his own. He is still the creator God, the way that we would understand him to be.
And that's, as we think about that sometimes, there's probably some folks out there right now that are already going like, whoa, I don't know about this. But we do believe in spiritual beings, you know what I mean? And we believe in angels and demons, like that these are spiritual beings that, now, Heiser would say they have specific roles, that's why they're called certain things.
And
but
we'll come back and talk about that.
We'll come back to
later.
that. But that this is why he calls it the unseen realm. There's a spiritual reality, and that there's a group of spiritual beings that are interacting at least with God.
Now, Heiser takes this and kind of makes it the central part of the narrative of Scripture, though, really, that there's this battle that's going on between the spiritual forces of darkness and those who are those spiritual beings, those Elohim, let's say, that are faithful to God. And so we'll say a bit more about this. So one of the things he talks about, he uses this language of God's spiritual or heavenly family, that he created this divine counsel. And he would see this as before the creation of the earth and the creation account we read about in Genesis 1, that there was already this divine counsel that God had created as a spiritual family to, how do I say this, to rule with him over the spiritual realm or the heavenly realm. Let's use that term. And then in the creation of the earth, God's idea is to create humanity, to create human beings to be his earthly family. So he's got a heavenly family and an earthly family. And in the same way, and again, there's lots of scriptures that this brings to your mind, but he created humanity then, according to Heiser's point of view, in order to rule over, which is what we see in the creation account, to rule over the earth. So the divine counsel rules with God over the heavenly realms, and humans are created in order to rule over the earth. And this is where he understands some problems begin, because he would say that these spiritual beings have free will in the same way that human beings have the will to either accept God or reject him, that these spiritual beings do as well. and even the idea of creating humanity apparently caused some of them to rebel against God, is the way that he would understand this. So that's kind of the first part. That kind of is how he got interested in this whole area. But then there's another passage, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, that becomes very important to Heiser. And in fact, several times in his book, he calls this the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So I'm going to read the Deuteronomy 32, 8 for you, and then maybe you want to make a comment about it. Mm-hmm. It says, when the Most High, talking about God, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples. And that word peoples, by the way, well, I won't say too much about that, but he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number, and I'm going to read this according to the NIV, according to the number of the sons of Israel. So let me go back and read that whole thing, and then I'm going to come back and say something else. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, if you look in your NIV, I read that out of the NIV, the ESV includes this reading I'm getting ready to give you. You'll have a footnote at that point that says both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint agree that the reading is sons of God, not sons of Israel, but sons of God. And the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text we have, you got to remember, is a pretty late text. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint both would be based on earlier text types. So a lot of times when they agree, when the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint agree against the Masoretic text, that's the reading that we consider to be the more accurate. So according to the number of the sons of God, and his idea is the sons of God is a way to refer to this divine council. Now, did you want to say what's your thoughts on this passage?
Well,
you want to say more about how he understands it?
Yeah, well, I mean, he sees this as according to the sons of God. So that the term sons of God is always, it seems to be in the Old Testament referring to spiritual being. Like
right.
It's kind of what he sees as among the, so when he sees back in Psalm 82:1, among the gods, that we're seeing here again when he says, according in Deuteronomy 32:8, according to the sons of God, it's referring to those spiritual beings. Yeah. And I thought was interesting, this, I'm not a Hebrew textual critic person. I know you would have a better idea of that, but that typically when we see those disagreements, and I think it applies the same way to Greek as it does to Hebrew, typically the more difficult reading is probably the one that is the more accurate. And so, a podcast I'd listened to was like, you could see someone reading Sons of God and a scribe kind of going like, I'm not sure what we should do with this. And it makes it Sons of Israel. It's seeing like they're on explain. It's easier to explain Sons of Israel than it is Sons of God, but that those earliest texts that we have seem to reference as Sons of God, and that's why, again, ESV has it as Sons of God. There are other translations that have it as Sons of God, Sons of God, but then their NIV uses Sons of Israel. So it's kind of there's something happening in the text here that happened along the way. So
Deuteronomy 32 then becomes very important for him, and he calls, like I said, he calls his view kind of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. He would say, and I was going to mention this, Paul uses this a reference to this verse. He doesn't quote it per se, but he alludes to this verse in Deuteronomy 32:8 when he's talking on the Areopagus, when he's talking to the men of Athens. And he says there this idea that God set the boundaries in place. Now, Heiser, it's not just this, he calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, but he sees Deuteronomy 32 here referring to an earlier event. He understands this in a reference to the Tower of Babel. And when God divided up the languages and the nation, set them in place in that situation. But then, according to the sons of God, he would say that God essentially assigned different members of this divine council to oversee different nations, different peoples. And so that's that. And I'll go ahead and give away the ending. This becomes when they fail, the judgment we see in the Psalm 82, when they fail to continue to do what God had called them to do, then he calls them to judgment. And so we see these divine members of the divine council not leading these people in accordance with God. And there's some question even, was this a judgment on the nations because of what they were doing in the Tower of Babel, that God gave them these gods or these spiritual beings over the nations?
So like each nation that's been separated from each other in the Genesis 11 Tower of Babel, Babel event, are given a spiritual being is assigned to them in that region.
So when we see in the ancient world and in the Old Testament text these different nations worshiping various gods, then this is where that comes from. It's a speculative. This is where you begin to see Heiser. One of the things you and I kept saying is there's lots of explanatory power in this, in his understanding, and we're going to see later on. There's even some things that it helps us understand, but it also is relatively speculative. And I think that's where we need to maybe take a little bit more caution. When you take something speculative and then you build other stuff on top of it, that's when you get kind of into shaky ground. But let me talk a little bit more about the Tower of Babel. Heiser believes that there are three stages in the early chapters of the book of Genesis that are rebellions against God. And this is where Genesis 6 comes into it. So the first rebellion against God that we see in Genesis is the fall. That's Genesis chapter 3, the typical fall that we would understand. He would understand the serpent there to be one of these divine beings, or these, I keep using the term divine. I really want to call them spiritual beings. One of these spiritual beings that was that didn't like the idea of humans ruling over the earth. And so he comes and he takes this role of questioning God, questioning Yahweh God. And so this serpent then, and Heiser brings in lots of other ancient literature that talks about the idea of the serpent, that it's really not a physical, it's not like a snake crawling around on the ground, but it is the appearance of a spiritual being to Adam and Eve, which makes some sense, I think, in that context.
Why Eve is not surprised when we think of a snake talking to her.
When a snake starts talking to her, right? That's one of the questions you're left with there. So I thought that was an interesting idea. And again, he's very creative and lots of really interesting ideas. Second rebellion is that in the flood narrative. That's Genesis chapter 6. Go ahead and read this. We know these passages well, but go ahead and read verses 1 through 4 for me, if you don't mind, Ryan.
Yep.
And there's lots of questions about this passage. Obviously, we've talked about how Enoch answers some of these questions, and others. That this is something people have speculated about for a long time. Well, here's where Heiser understands it. So,
when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by him. They were the heroes of old, men of renown.
So this idea of sons of God, we've already kind of given away the fact that Heiser always understands this to be divine beings. So there's nothing hidden here, right? He understands this to be, and of course there's problems with this view, and not everybody has this view, but this idea that the sons of God are these spiritual beings that essentially had sexual relations with daughters of men, and these Nephilim are giants that are born to, or from this union, I should say, the sons of God, these spiritual beings, and the daughters of men. And this results in wickedness increasing on the earth, and of course results in the flood. So that whole idea is how he would explain that to be a rebellion of these sons of God. In other words, they're not maintaining their proper role, but they are essentially intermarrying between the spiritual family of God and the earthly family of God. And this is another rebellion that takes place. So there's a lot that he goes back to in order to try to explain this. And I'll say more about that later. The third one is the Tower of Babel then. And Genesis 11, 8 through 9, it talks about this idea that they created a tower. And I'll go ahead and say mountains for Heiser are very important. They're seen as places where you go and meet with God. And he would understand the Tower of Babel to be one of these ziggurats that we have in the Middle East, which is a man-made mountains, basically. In other words, what the people were trying to do is instead of doing what God had mandated them to do, which was to spread out and to populate the earth and to take essentially the idea of take Eden and spread it out throughout the entire earth, they were instead in this rebelling against God's command and were trying to keep themselves together, which is what they say. And so this idea of the tower that they are building being essentially trying to reach to the heavens, that's why the mountains are seen as places where you meet God, because they're high places, they're toward the heavens. And so he understands then, taking Deuteronomy 32, this idea that the division of the peoples then is assigned. They're assigned these different spiritual beings. That's what he understands Deuteronomy 32, the sons of God, according to the number of sons of God, to be in reference to. And here's another part of this that he brings in is Genesis chapter 10 gives us a table of nations. If you've ever read that, it talks about where all the nations come from, and there are 70 nations in number. So that becomes a significant point in Heiser's overall construction and understanding all of this. So that's kind of how that Deuteronomy 32 worldview works in, as he says, this is what happened. So all this stuff about Israel and the nations, right? All these nations that are surrounding, and the different Old Testament language that talk about the nations coming up against Israel and all this that's the seen part of it. The unseen part of it is this spiritual battle that's going on between the sons of God who rebelled against God and those who are faithful to Him. So thoughts on that so far?
I mean, and this is the narrative that, that as Joshua is leading the conquest, why, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the land itself here in just a little bit, but why we get this narrative. Heiser sees this, the narrative of really cleansing the land and getting everyone out of it is so important. Because this is God's establishing a physical place here that connects to the spiritual realm as well.
Yeah, and he even mentions this group called the Anakim, which he thinks are related to these Nephilim. Giants, the Nephilim that we read about, and the places that he says you really need to get rid of these people. The Anakim are mentioned in those places, and so he says, So chapter 18 then he calls cosmic geography, and there were some things in there that really intrigued you, I know, but it goes along with this idea that the nations essentially are turned over to these spiritual beings, but Israel. And we're talking about physical, the land of Israel is this place that God reserves for a special place for His people. And His presence is mediated there in a different kind of way than it is in other places. So again, all these surrounding nations worship their gods, but Yahweh is the God of Israel. And so we see this connected in this way. And there's lots of different passages he brings in. You were going to talk about one, I think, that he mentioned specifically.
Well, partly for me, the story that I was like, oh, gosh, this really kind of made me catch my breath here a little bit, is talking about the story of Naaman, who was a general for a foreign army at one point.
Syrian army.
Yeah, Syrian army. And who's diagnosed with leprosy. And he comes to send some servants, I believe, to Elijah and says, what must I do to be healed? He wants to be healed. And he's told, come to the Jordan River and dip yourself in the Jordan River. I think it's 7 times.
Right.
And there's this whole thing of like, why do I need to come to the Jordan River? This whole narrative, that number one, it's dirty.
Yeah, don't I have superior rivers here in Syria? The Pharpar is a much better river. Yeah, why can't I just do it here?
And they're like, no, you need to come to this river. So story as Naaman goes, washes, and the leprosy falls off of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I have to say, like, this is part of the story that, you know I've read this, but I've never really spent too much time on it. And I'm gonna pick it up here. This is 2 Kings 5, chapter 14, and I'll put some emphasis on the thing that really got me. So I'm gonna start with 14, and we're gonna read through 17. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times. That's Naaman, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much dirt, as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." So the thing that stuck out to me, and I hope I emphasized it enough here if you're listening, is like, Naaman wants just some dirt. Like, give me a couple mules, give me a cart, and give me some dirt.
Right.
And I'm like, and so, like, I don't, it always meant like, well, this is great dirt, I guess, or something, like, remember his journey. But no, it seems to be, and then it's tied to him making sacrifices.
Right. He says, I'll never worship these other gods. I'm only going to worship Yahweh.
Right. Now, we don't know exactly what Naaman does with this dirt, but as Heiser points out, it seems to be that, like, there's something specifically about this dirt, about this land. Just like Naaman had to come to the Jordan River, it seems, at least in Naaman's mindset here, that there's something special about this dirt, about the land from this area, that he needs to take it with him so that he can worship. And so,
if you're going to worship the true God, you're going to worship on this
if you're going to worship
basically.
Yahweh, I need this soil. And so, as Heiser points out, there seems to be, he calls it the cosmic geography, that, like, there's something about the land of Israel that it is, there's something connected to the land and the spiritual reality of worshiping Yahweh.
And you said something very important there. You said in the mindset of Naaman, at least, and this is one of the things I do admire about Heiser, and I think he's correct in saying this. He begins by saying, we need to look at the Bible in the way that in the mindset of the people who would have been, writing it originally or receiving it originally. We need to get into their mindset, and we don't have that mindset of these spiritual beings and that kind of thing. We've talked about that before, even when we talked about Charles Taylor's book. We have this kind of view of ourselves that we're insulated from the spiritual realm as opposed to 500 years ago, let's say. But he's saying the people in this time, these spiritual beings would have been seen to be real. Things like cosmic geography would have been seen to be real. So in Naaman's mind, if I'm going to worship the God of this land, I need to take part of the land with me. And that seems to be the implication. You said you never thought about that. I mean, I don't think I'd ever even noticed that part of it. I noticed the whole thing with you need to come to Israel, that Naaman wasn't willing to go. And, basically they said, well, what do you have to lose? It's not too hard of a thing he's asking you to do. And so why don't you go and see? And then he becomes essentially a convert to the worship of the true God. But yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, it was always, when you hear that story about Naaman, it's about trusting God, and he's got to travel to Israel and all that stuff. But I'm like, I don't know if I've ever spent too much time talking about, like, oh, Naaman wants a pile of dirt. Like,
right. You didn't.
Hey, if you want to accept this blessing, just give me some dirt.
You didn't have the flannel board with the little piles of dirt and the mules taking them away.
No, we didn't.
We'll have to remember that. So one of the things that I really had to think a lot about it, and we had an episode on First Enoch not too long ago, and for Heiser, he uses First Enoch a lot, and we'll say even more about this next week when we talk about the New Testament. He mentions this idea that First Enoch is mentioned both in Second Peter and also in the book of Jude, which we've discussed already. But he does seem to give a lot more credibility to Enoch's interpretation of the events, I will say. So when we talked about First Enoch, I talked about it has a very advanced angelology. There's this idea of all these spiritual beings, and for Heiser, those things kind of fit really well into his worldview. So that's another area I think I don't know that I can go all the way with him, but your point here, there's a great deal of explanatory power in his argument. Where you have these kind of these weird passages, and it's like, well, what in the world could this mean that he wants to take the dirt? And when he explains it in the way that he does, you're like, well, okay, I kind of see what you're saying. He's taking, the land of Israel, so to speak, into this foreign land where a different God is worshipped, a different spiritual being.
And it doesn't seem that Elisha stops him. Elisha doesn't try to stop him. Elisha doesn't say like, well, you don't need this dirt. God is everywhere. Right. It's like, yeah, sure. Well, that sounds reasonable.
And you mentioned that, we're going to talk about the New Testament next week, but it reminded me very much of Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, where it's like, well, where should we worship the true God? On this mountain, Mount Gerizim, or is it on Mount Zion? And the Jesus answer is there's a time coming when the geography is not going to matter, right? That there's an expansion, and the whole idea of the expansion of the kingdom is that God's kingdom is now going out into all the world like it was intended to do from the beginning. So didn't mean to get into that, but I do want to mention mountains are very important to Heiser. He talks about this phrase that we see in the Old Testament, the heights of the north. And this is another one of those areas I think, there are interesting ideas he has here, and some even that we're going to see in the New Testament next week. But he mentions the mountain of Bashan particularly several times. It's this mountain up in the north that's kind of a stronghold for the spiritual forces of evil, so to speak. And a lot of this comes from Ugaritic, from the Ugaritic documents, the Ugaritic language. And I will say it's interesting to me. Heiser, really uses Ugaritic a lot, which is a relatively recent development. We didn't really have any way to understand those texts until the middle part of the last century, 1970s, and so is really when that became a major field of study. So a lot of these are things that have helped us understand. Basically, all these texts are Canaanite religious texts. They tell us about the religion of the Canaanite people. And so he uses a lot of those in order to help us understand and illustrate various parts of the Old Testament. Among them are how he understands those those spiritual beings. And he talks about these other nations around. Their gods have divine councils, and so Yahweh has this divine council as well. But he brings in that a lot to talk about these mountains, and that's the mountain of Bashan is kind of seen as this stronghold against God's people. I will say several times in the Old Testament, the north, there's no disputing this, and that's the other thing. There are things he says, and you're like, well, yeah, every Old Testament scholar thinks this. The north is the place from which the enemies of Israel are seen to be coming. It's true whether it was Assyria, whether it was Babylon, all these bad things come from the north. And Heiser is simply suggesting there's a spiritual element to this as well, not just the kings, but also, or the armies, but also the spiritual element as well. You want to talk about Daniel 10? This is one of those passages that he uses to talk about the fact that these spiritual beings were given domain over certain nations. And so here's one that's mentioned in Daniel 10. And this is, again, one of those weird passages. We talked about this back in our series on Daniel. But he says this, do not be afraid, Daniel. This is verse 12. Since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. This is this divine being, the spiritual being, who's going to be, we talked before about apocalyptic literature, typically has these spiritual, these heavenly messengers, right? And so he says, I've come in response to them, but the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, and again, this is pretty commonly understood. Michael's understood to be we usually call him an archangel, right? which we'll come talk about that a bit more in a minute. But Michael comes and it says he came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I've come to explain to you what will happen to your peoples in the future, for the vision concerns the time yet to come. So the whole point is that this spiritual being says, I was kept from coming to you, Daniel, because the prince of Persia. And so the way that Heiser interprets this is the spiritual being that was assigned to the nation of Persia was the one who was preventing this spiritual messenger from God. So we see this battle taking place. And then Michael comes to another, spiritual being loyal to God, comes and helps and allows the messenger to come and bring the message to Daniel that he needs to. So that's another one of those, kind of passages that he would explain in this way.
Yeah, we dealt with that when we did our Daniel series. We
talked about that.
How do we? I mean, it says what it says. How do we? Instead of us trying to talk our way out of it, how do we understand?
And I do. Heiser would say that. He would say that we shouldn't ignore these passages. Just because they seem too hard for us sometimes, we should make sure to spend time on it. Job 1's another one of these weird passages, right? That people ask about. It's another of these divine council settings where God is on his throne and he seems to be surrounded by this spiritual family, to use Heiser's phrase, that he's, interacting with and he's talking to, these kind of things. So go ahead and read Job 1:6 and notice that note I make there on angels there.
One day the angels, which in Hebrew literally says sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with him. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it."
And of course, then they get this whole thing, well, if you consider my servant Job and so forth. Now, Satan in the Old Testament, we've talked about this as well, means the adversary or the accuser. It's not a proper name, even though in most of our English text it capitalizes Satan. And by the time we get to the New Testament, then we see Jesus using the term, it seems like in a proper noun kind of way. But in the Old Testament, the Satan is again more of a role. And also mention this, it was interesting to me when I looked this up in the NIV that they had translated what is literally the sons of God as the angels. And Heiser really has a difficulty with this because he would say angel, which in Hebrew is the word malach, and which in Greek is the word angelos. That's where we get our word angel. Those words both mean messenger. Right. So they're sometimes used in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, not for a spiritual being, but for a messenger. Right. That's right. The word that means messenger. We have come to use that term angel for spiritual being. And Heiser would say this sometimes keeps us from seeing the unseen nature of some, the unseen realm nature of some of these texts. And so in this one, angel would be again a role, whereas these spiritual beings, he would say, are even of different kinds. He mentioned the idea of archangel. There could even be different categories of these spiritual beings. He's like, we don't know. Enoch and other texts from the intertestamental period or later will develop this idea more, I think, and we do see more of those. Anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think one thing I've been thinking about, I just want to make sure we say, is Heiser would say, Yahweh is not dependent upon
right. I'm glad you said that.
These spiritual beings. It's not like Yahweh needs them. Right. It is out of his choice that he has created them to counsel him. You know what I mean? He is, again, I know we kind of said this, that there is no Elohim like Yahweh,
right?
But that he is independent of them, and so right. He sees this as advisory, but that the decision maker. So he even points this out in the beginning of Genesis when it says, "Let's make them in our image." There's this plural, but then the verb create, and then he created them is singular. It is right. God is the Yahweh himself singularly creates them.
He
But
doesn't
that
need help.
this isn't. He doesn't need help. They're not creative like Yahweh, but they're an advisory capacity to him.
And I mean, in some ways, it's almost like he's doing these things in their presence. It's almost more like they are witnesses. In this next passage, that's where we're going to in Job 38. I think we see this very clearly. This was one of those that again struck me when he looked at it this way. The parallel he drew that I thought was really to what you're talking about that I thought was really interesting. He said God didn't create humans because he needed them because he needed them either, right? He created us wanting to share in this work with us, right? Because of his desire to, not because of any need on his part, but he chooses to work through his creation. That's something about his nature that is true. Whether and Heiser would say whether it's talking about the spiritual family or the earthly family in this.
And he kind of points out that in that Genesis narrative that as the early Israelites would have read in our image, they didn't have a Trinitarian understanding yet. And so like they had a different understanding of our than we do from the New Testament post Jesus and the Spirit coming as we read it back. So
this is where we would have the we're going to create them in an image of the spiritual beings, essentially in this nature. Yeah. So Job 38, go ahead and read this. And he sees stars as spiritual beings. And again, I'm going to come back and remind you again, one of the things that Heiser's insisted on that I would agree with is we need to understand this language within the worldview of the people who were writing these. And they understood the stars as spiritual beings. So here's one example in Job 38 where this is that passage where God is really questioning Job, where he says, okay, Job, shut up for a minute. Let me talk to you. And here's one of the things he says.
Yeah.
You have that
so
passage?
This is Job 38, 4-7. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what where its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy.
So this idea of the morning stars and the angels they're not active in creation. They're essentially the audience, for creation as God is doing these things. And you can see they're already in existence, right? They're already there watching. So I have to say, this is one of those places where Heiser, and I'll say, I think his book's been great. We both have really thought it was a good one. It's one of these that makes you look at passages again more carefully and in a different kind of way, I think. And so this idea of stars being spiritual beings, there are several passages, even in the New Testament. We may look at a couple of them next week that have this kind of language. One passage I forgot to bring up is I was going to bring up the Lucifer, the bringer of light passage too, and just kind of look at it in that way, which Heiser does see as a reference to the king of Tyre, but going back to talking about this rebellion, using the spiritual rebellion of the spiritual beings as a background for understanding this. But stars, even in the book of Revelation, again, not to bring in the New Testament too quickly, but where it talks about the dragon, they swept a third of the stars of heaven out of the sky, which we understand to be a reference to fallen. I would have said fallen angels in the past, but I'm going to say fallen spiritual beings. In this rebellion. So, the one final thing I wanted to mention, then we'll see if there's anything else. The angel of Yahweh, or the angel of the Lord in English that we see in the Old Testament. I think Heiser's kind of changed my mind on this, because I'd taken kind of the view that most modern scholars have today that this angel of the Lord is not a divine being, but he uses this idea of two powers, and he would say that this was a teaching within understanding within Judaism up until after the New Testament period. He would say really it was a response to the Trinitarian view of Christians that caused the two powers to be seen as more of a heretical idea within Judaism. And I haven't traced that out to see if that's the case, but this is how he explains it. But he would see the angel of Yahweh then as God physically representing, as a physical representation of the creator God. And then you have Yahweh, who's the God, the Creator God, and you see them interacting and in different ways. And I had noticed this in the past. For example, when the angel of Yahweh appears to Abraham, and then later Yahweh is the one who's speaking. It seems like they both have this
kind of
role.
Bounces back and forth between the two of them.
And so he would take an understanding of this. It's called the two powers understanding, which then he would say in the New Testament, when we have this idea of the Spirit of God as well, that we then have this idea of the Trinity being fully formed. He doesn't read Trinity back into the Old Testament, but he does say that the origins of the Trinity, at least, now I shouldn't say the origins, but there's a way that we can have this understanding of this idea in the two powers, the angel of Yahweh and then Yahweh himself.
Yeah. There's a lot in there. As we said, it's like a 400-page book. And that, there's just a lot that, I think it's, if you're interested in this, I think it's definitely worth a read to get in there and to see it. Because I think we talked about explanatory power, and it's one of those things we kind of go, how many thousands of years are we separated from these events? That kind of going, we live in a different mindset than the ancient Israelites, and ancient Hebrews. And so I think there's a humility as we approach these texts to see this, to kind of go like, we all feel, I think, for the most part, pretty comfortable in the New Testament. In some of those things, it's a world that we understand more clearly in some ways. Not totally, right. I understand that. But in that ancient world, to kind of go, there is, they understood things differently than we do. Right. And that we can't shy away from these texts that kind of make us go, I'm not so sure about, or what did he really mean? Oh, he couldn't have meant that. But that Heiser, I think, is saying like there can be a way that we can understand these texts that brings them all together to help us get a better idea of what's happening in the Old Testament.
That is the power, I think, of his argument. We both listened to another podcast where an Old Testament professor was kind of critiquing some of Heiser's views. And one of the things that he said is really the biggest criticism he had was that there are things that he would hold more contingently, say, well, that's a possibility, but I don't know that I'm going to say that for sure, where Heiser has a great deal of confidence and says, this is how it is. And then, like I said, builds other things on top of it. So I would say when you read this, absolutely, it helped you. I think it helps you understand the worldview, as you mentioned, the ancient world. I think it may give you new insight into certain texts. But I do think we need to, as with anything we read, use caution and think through some of these things more carefully. So,
and just that other podcast you referenced there, I'll put a link to it. You can watch that if you want to. I think one of the things that I appreciated, there was a question,
and then you can
watch ours first, Sparse Career, obviously, is that the question was asked, like, would this be considered an orthodox position?
Right.
And this Old Testament professor said, yeah, like by and large, this is a very considered an orthodox position among Old Testament scholars. Like this is not something outside of the realm of a reality for these texts.
A lot of the pieces that he would say, well, the majority of Old Testament scholars would think this. I do think the other value of Heiser is he does bring our attention to the spiritual realm that, like you said, we often will kind of ignore. But absolutely. And then the other point he makes, he doesn't deny any of the mainstream doctrines. Any of the he's not denying anything about the uniqueness of the Creator God. He's not saying anything about the deity of Jesus that would be heretical. He's very much, he's not saying Jesus is a created being or something along those lines. So he's orthodox in that sense. So,
Well, Brian, it's a great conversation.
Yeah.
Glad we had it. So if you enjoy the podcast, you can go to thebiblebistro.com. We have a little bookstore on there. If you like, I'm going to put this book on there. If you'd like to pick up a copy, if you click through the link through there, we get a small portion of the purchase price from Amazon. I mean, we're talking cents here. So, we're not.
But it adds up.
It adds up. Yes, so you can purchase that, or there are other books in there on different topics. You can also follow us and get our list of socials there. You can follow us on the Bible Bistro on Facebook and Instagram, or you can follow us on Apple Podcasts and give us a review if you're enjoying this. So we appreciate everyone that's listening. Brian, thanks so much for leading this conversation, and hope you'll join us again next week as we can kind of continue this conversation as we start looking at how this concept of the unseen realm plays out in the New Testament. So pretty excited about that, and looking forward to it.
All right. Stay tuned.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Bye-bye.